Welcome everyone to this year's AGM. In a way, every year can be seen as an Orwellian year. Orwell the man and his writings are rarely out of the news. Paradoxically, Orwell, the committed socialist, had become a sort of brand in the capitalist marketplace. First editions of his books fetch enormous prices. Did you see that the 3-page letter he wrote to the novelist Anthony Powell from his hospital bed on 8th of March 1948 was expected to fetch $15,000 at an upcoming auction in the United States? Not surprisingly, this year has been very busy for us in the Orwell Society. One of the highlights was the unveiling in November last year of Martin Jennings' statue of Orwell, commissioned by the BBC. Those of you who were at last year's AGM will remember the talk by Baroness Janet Whittaker, who, along with her late husband, has done so much to promote the project. Given that Orwell was a compulsive smoker, the statue is suitably close to a place where smokers at the corporation are allowed a puff. Alongside it runs, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." A rather dismissive article in Private Eye about the statue and its plinth gave the committee an opportunity to remind its readers that Orwell would probably have had mixed views about the statue. While he valued his time at the BBC, he did describe his time there between 1941 and 1943 as something halfway between a girls' school and a lunatic asylum. The weekend of activities in Wigan in March last year to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the publication of The Road to Wigan Pier was another wonderful success. And the link with Wigan continues. We actually delayed the start of this AGM so that members attending last night, the new musical by Alan Gregory, inspired by The Road and performed by the people of Wigan, with Richard Blair as the narrator, could arrive here in time. Later this year, we celebrate the anniversary of the publication of Down and Out in Paris and London. We have a plaque unveiling at the Orwell's house in Southwold, more trips to Jura and Paris, and then 2019 is the big anniversary, Cat B, Big A, year of 1984.
The event last night at Wigan, I think as a society we should be very proud of. Wigan was very hostile in retrospect to Orwell after the book was published. The event we had in March had included the plan to have presentations or dramatic pieces by little groups of writers that were mentored by English Pen. One of those groups was a group of school children. Very shortly before the event, Barbara Nettleton of Sunshine House, who has created this amazing community hub, felt it would be unfair to those children because 200 people and she didn't think they were ready. So she asked Alan, who's a trustee of Sunshine House, could you fill that gap with a song or something? He rapidly produced 3 wonderful songs which are well on their way to being turned into a full-scale musical, the musical content of which we heard last night, and two things happened really. One was this enormous burst of creativity because we'd given people a platform, if you like. As a consequence of that, they have some really big ambitions to create Wigan-based events in order that talented young children who should be going to a good music school or a good drama school or whatever, but their parents can't afford it, won't have that problem in the future. The aim is to create a trust fund to do that.
I'd like to invite Katie Pegg, please, to the front. Katie is a student at City University, the Creative Writing and Publishing MA, who has won this year's Dystopian Fiction Prize. Her story, The Dressmakers, which will be published in our journal later this year, was commended by the judges for its literary flair, its impressive build-up of suspense, strong imagery and surreal quality, displaying many intriguing dystopian elements. So congratulations. Yet another student from the city. Richard is now going to hand over the prizes, which are...
Right. Catherine, it's my great pleasure to present you with our £500 cheque.
Thank you very much.
Not at all. For 1 year only, you get a bust of my father.
So we have clearly an Orwellian polymath. Am I right? David's certainly proved that now. We know him very well as an author of one of the best biographies of Orwell, certainly award-winning.
The story, Orwell and Southwell seems to be rather sort of in the air at the moment, because as was mentioned during the AGM proceedings, there's a very good little book by Ronald Binns which has just been published, which brings together all kinds of existing information and adds some other things that he's ferreted out himself. And we're beginning to know more about what was always, I think, a rather obscure and recondite part of Orwell's career. People tend, it's always assumed, with fairly good reason, I think, that Southwell on the Suffolk coast is Knight Hill in A Clergyman's Daughter, of which certainly the narrator has the writer had no very great opinion. And in fact, Knight Hill, which I think, Orwell brings inland, it's not on the coast, I think it's more like, I think he wants the reader to identify it more with Bury St Edmunds than he does with Southwell, but it has 6,000 inhabitants rather than 2,000, and various other discrepancies. But I think Orwell wants the reader not to think that the kind of genteel bourgeois life lived out in this Suffolk fastness was a particularly agreeable one. It tends to be forgotten, though, that Orwell spent really rather a long time of here, rather a great part of his short life in Southwell. His parents retired there. He went to the Army Crammer there in 1922 before he went to Burma. He then came back and lived on and off with his parents for many years. He recuperated there for several months in the early part of 1934 after he'd been ill with pneumonia. He paid his last visit there in 1939 when his father was dying. So if you totted up the days that Orwell spent in Southwell, they would accumulate, I think, probably to several years' worth. And some very important relationships of his were conducted there. And the particular one I want to sort of tell you about this afternoon, which becomes in the end, and takes on all the trappings, all the paraphernalia of a biographer's quest, that eternal, the biographer's search for his subject, even now not fully realised, concerns Eleanor Jakes. I think it's pronounced Jakes rather than Jarks. I think authorities differ on this, but her daughter always used to say that it was Jakes. Now, Eleanor, when Orwell came back living in Southwell on and off with his parents in the late 1920s, he made a particular friend in Southwell called Dennis Collins. Dennis Collins, I think, was a couple of years younger than him. He'd gone off in his very early 20s to be a sisal farmer in Africa and come back and was studying anthropology at Cambridge and coming back on vacations to stay with his parents. And his father, Dr. Collins, was the Southwell doctor. Orwell made a great friend of Dennis, and he also made a friend of another friend of Dennis's, which was a woman called Eleanor Jakes, who lived at Reydon. And that it became something more of a friendship is evidenced by the letters in the Collected Orwell, so ably edited by Peter Davison. And it turned, as far as we can establish, it turned into a kind of Jules A. Jim relationship within two men interested in one woman. The difficulty of conducting a relationship like that at Suffolk Market Town in the early 1930s was that everybody was in on the case. It's a small, only 2,000 inhabitants. And I remember interviewing a woman who was the daughter of, she was called Esme May, and she was in her late 80s when I spoke to her. She's long dead. In fact, her sister died a couple of years ago at the age of 100, the last survivor of the May family. And Jessie May, these girls' mother, was the Orwell's daily, the Blair family, of course, daily help when they lived in Queen Street in the late 1920s. And I can remember this old lady saying to me, you know, and of course she was only a small girl then, you know, 11 or 12, and she said, everybody knew that these two, you know, Eleanor was sort of caught between these two sort of commanding male figures, and the whole town was kind of on tenterhooks to see which way she would jump. And as Eleanor's daughter, who I'm going to get on to and talk to you about in a moment, said that, you know, you would actually walk down the street and you would hear, as Eleanor passed, you would hear a rustic say to another one, she'd go with that Collins boy. So this was, you know, the kind of atmosphere in which it all took place. And the letters which survive in the collected edition are, they show, obviously on the one hand, they show how intimate the relationship became. I won't go into detail, but, you know, there were escapades in the bosky verdure of the woods at Blythe and this kind of thing. And they were on this, but also, you can see that Orwell is tremendously attracted to Eleanor, that he obviously wants to marry her. Nothing of hers survives. There is a lot of, you know, dearest Eleanor, you know, for God's sake, if you love me, meet me behind the W.H. Smith kiosk at 3:15. For God's sake, do not forget, you know. So there was clearly a great deal of ardour on his side. And we know, well, I know, you know, from having had conversations with Eleanor's daughter, Susanna, that he was very confidential with her. In fact, it was to Eleanor that he came home one day from Ipswich in the latter part of 1932 and announced he was going to call himself George Orwell. He came back, because as you doubtless know, homage to the down and out in Paris and London, he originally didn't want it published under his own name because, I think largely because he thought that his very respectable parents would be somewhat discomforted by some of the subject matter. And again, as many people know, he submitted a list of pseudonyms to his agent. And the three pseudonyms were, I think, P.S. Burton, which was his tramping name he used in down and out hostels, H. Lewis Always, and Kenneth Miles. So you think that 1984 might have been written by H. Lewis Always. But anyway, so he came back and apparently said to Eleanor, I'm going to call myself George Orwell because it's the king's name, the Orwell, the river that runs through Ipswich, a good solid English name, George Orwell. This was the latter part of 1932 when their relationship was getting up to the boil, and after which it steadily simmered down again into nothing. And faced with this choice, Eleanor decided that Dennis was the better bet. And again, Susanna, her daughter, when questioned about this, would say that her mother had said, and she couldn't quite remember, but her mother had said that either was Orwell was too satirical, or he was too cynical. And those were the two reasons. One of those two reasons, or perhaps the two combined, was why she didn't want to marry him. And Orwell, as far as we know, was terribly upset, and she went off and married Dennis. They were married in 1934. The Collinses then moved themselves to the Far East. Ultimately, Dennis became the curator of the Raffles Museum in Singapore. Obviously, they had to get out of Singapore in the 1940s with the Japanese invading. And Susanna, Eleanor's elder daughter, remembered you know, how her mother did, to a certain extent, keep this flame burning. And she remembered her mother bursting into tears in 1950 when the news came over on the radio. And so there was always this kind of, there was the lurking shadow of Orwell, you know, hung over their lives subsequently. So that's the story of, in a nutshell, of George, or Eric as he then was, and Eric and Dennis and Eleanor. Now, fast forward on, and I say this is where it turned into the nature of a biographer's quest. I started working on what was billed to be a centenary life of Orwell, to hit the 2003 centenary of his birth in the late 1990s. And I was quite lucky in one way, because I was convinced that the Southwold aspect of Orwell's life had been rather neglected. I mean, Crick doesn't really go into it a very great deal. I'm not sure whether Michael Sheldon even went there when he wrote his book in 1991. By the grace of God, I come from Norwich, where I live now, and Southwold was where we used to go on family holidays in the 1970s. So I was familiar, with the plaque up on the wall of Montague House. I was familiar with the legend, and even, as a teenager, of course, being a huge Orwell fan, I was kind of staking the joint out, wandering around, seeing what I can see. Albeit that there are very few actual physical traces of Orwell. In fact, I remember, this is years ago, this is after the book came out in the mid-2000s, I remember suddenly being told by the letting agent of the holiday let that we were going to go and stay in, oh, I'm terribly sorry, but the roof at 30 Stradbroke Road has just come down, but we can move you into 40 Stradbroke Road if you like. In exchange, a kind of light went on in my head, 40 Stradbroke Road, Brighton Villas. That's where the Blairs moved in 1922. It was the first house they lived in. Oh my God, I'm going to go around there and I'll look under the sofa and there'll be all these letters that no one's ever noticed. There'll be Orwellian residents. I was terribly excited. You know, I signed up to write an article for a newspaper without even having gone through the door because I was sure there would be something. So I went, and the house had been refurbished so many times that the only authentic feature that remained was the letterbox on the front door. That was the only thing that remained in 1922. So no Orwellian residences whatsoever. But it was still good to have actually stayed in a house which Orwell wandered around himself in Southwold. So I started going to Southwold in the late 1990s. And I knew a couple called Richard and Victoria Webster, who were the first proprietors of what was the Orwell bookshop, who were very helpful. And they introduced me, or put me in touch with Susanna Collins, who was Dennis Collins' daughter. And I discovered, this is about 1988, 98, 99, that amazingly, at the age of 94, Dennis Collins was still alive. So I cased the joint. I acquired entry to 24 Stradbroke Road, the Collins household. Unfortunately, Dennis, who this time was, I say, was in his mid-90s, and unfortunately his mind is completely gone, and he could not say a coherent sentence, but still I can say that I have sat in a room with Dennis Collins. Now, Susanna, his daughter, was was quite a formidable proposition, a great guardian of her parents' memory, and very helpful to me, the aspiring biographer. And I used to go, when I was in Southwold researching, there was still at that point some 85 and 90-year-olds left who just about remembered Orwell around the place. And the Southwoldians had no very great opinion of Orwell. They thought he was a bit of a, what would the expression, somebody referred to as a spring poet. Something like a tramp, but the general opinion of the older Southwold people that he was sponging off his respectable parents. And a lot of the fuss that was then being made, they couldn't really understand. They couldn't quite work out why this Southwoldian who hadn't really liked the place should have acquired such celebrity. Although here and there you did find extraordinarily interesting little fragments of old Southwold life that had actually made their way into his novels. And I remember interviewing an old gentleman with the very euphonious Suffolk name of Bumstead, George Bumstead, who had actually been a grocer, the greengrocer of the town in the 1930s. And he was quite interesting. He didn't tell me anything particularly that I didn't know. And as I was about to leave his house in Victoria Street, Southwold, he called me back and he said, "Oh, there's something you can put in your book." He said, that George Orwell, he put my brother in his book." And I said, "What do you mean, he put your brother in his book?" He said, "That's right, you go back and read that in 1984 and you'll see it's got my brother in it." So I went back and I read, and I came to the scene in the Ministry of Love where Winston Smith is sitting there next to the obviously starving man in the queue waiting to be interrogated, and the man next to him gives him a piece of bread, and the telescreen goes, Bumstead J 21573, let fall that piece of bread." Jack Bumstead, the grocer's son from Southwold, rematerialised 15 years later, in 1984. So Susanna, as I say, was very helpful, was affable, showed me the signed first editions on the mantelpiece, rather in the bookcase. Very affable, but I suspected cagey. And I always thought that there was more, and I, of course, having interviewed her, sort of kind of opinions, and we had a South Bank show television programme about this, on which Susanna appeared to great advantage. And I was always saying to her, obviously, is there any other unpublished material that didn't appear in the collected letters that Peter Davison assembled? "Oh, well, my father's studies," there was this kind of enormous room on the upper floor, which was Dennis's study. And that is, no, I never really kind of, when the builders were in for the 5 years that I knew Susanna in that house. And I said, when the builders are gone, then we might sort of go and see what we could sort of have a look. But there's all kinds of things, but I don't really think there is anything. And I'm not sure that I would want it anyway, because it's all very intimate, isn't it, and all this kind of, I said, okay, fine. And then, so this went on, and we kept in touch, and the book was published, and Susanna appeared in the television programme, which she appeared to enjoy doing. And then in 2008, Susanna died very unexpectedly. Literally, I think, was frying herself tea and just dropped down dead of an unsuspected heart complaint. And shortly after that, I was contacted by Bonhams, the auctioneers, to say that they were selling all Dennis Collins's effects, all his papers. Would I like to come and have a look at the auction house? And I did this, I have to say, you know, as a professional biographer, I did this with rather a heavy heart, because I knew what it entailed. It meant that they were going to be breaking up this collection of papers and flogging everything to people who might not be terribly interested in what the Orwell estate wanted to do with it, might not be terribly interested in what people like yourself might be interested in it, might not be very helpful to scholars and potential biographers. But I went down there and I had a look, and there was an enormous box. As I say, previously he'd been a sisal farmer in Kenya, so there were 1,000 upon 1,000 photographs of people bringing in the sisal, and you know, exotic Kenyan antelopes bounding across the veldt, whatever its equivalent is in Kenya, and all this was quite interesting. But I looked through the photographs, and I did actually find, you know, there were shots outside Eleanor's house in Raiden of this big tall chap and Eleanor and various other people. And there was an absolutely fascinating document which turned out to be Dr. Collins's engagement book in the 1930s. And you could see even then just how ill Eric was, because you know Eric, and there'd been blocked out appointments for a week. And you could see where old Mr. Blair was obviously dying in 1939, and the number of visits to Richard Blair at Montague House. All that was fascinating. But I knew what was going to happen to the collection, and of course, 2 or 3 years later, when the residue of it all turned up at Suffolk Record Office, and I went around to have a look, it had been absolutely picked clean, you know, by them. There was hardly anything left. But that's as may be. And the other thing that the Collins family decided to sell was the originals of all the letters that had appeared in the collected edition edited by Peter Davison. So, you know, I had a look at these and said, yes, they're all very interesting, but they're in the public domain. Nothing, no particular story here. So they said, thanks very much. I went back home. A week later, an employee from Bonhams rang me, sounding rather like Minnie Mouse on helium. And she said, oh my God, you wouldn't believe what happened. We were clearing the house, somebody literally went into the woodshed, and there's this large brown envelope with the words, burn after my death, Eleanor Collins, written on them, and it's got a load of stuff in it. So, God, this was terribly exciting. Remember, this is 8, 9 years ago. I was terribly excited. Richard was terribly excited. Peter Davison was frothing at the mouth to be able to have a look at them. And what was going to happen, I was told, was that there was going to be a big article in the Sunday Telegraph advertising their discovery, these letters, of which there were 19 unpublished letters from Orwell to Eleanor were going to be sold, and, you know, being published, made everything. The article appeared in the newspaper, and it was a very curious piece of journalism, because it trumpeted the fact that all these papers had been discovered, but all the information that it supplied and all the quotations it produced were from letters that were already in the public domain. And I thought, that is a bit strange. A week later, Bonhams rang up and said, terribly sorry, terrible mistake, they're not going to be offered for sale at all, the family withdrawn them for sale, terribly sorry, thanks very much. And I said, this is ridiculous, you know, you've raised all these hopes only to dash them. I said, could I remind you that Richard Blair actually owns the copyright of these letters because they're his father's words. The Collins family may own the paper, Richard owned the words, and Richard, who you know, was instigated to ring up Bonhams, was virtually told to go away, I seem to remember. Yes, despite being, say, the copyright holder.
He was talking in helium again.
Yeah, that's right.
Papers, I know nothing about them.
So, all that was back in 2008, 2009. The really interesting thing that I can reveal and tell you is that 10 days ago I went and saw those letters, and they do exist, and there are 19 of them. Half of them are written in Orwell's. They're very curious letters, actually. One thing, he spells Eleanor's name in 3 different ways. Eleanor, like you know, with an extra O in the end, and the way you would expect it to be spelled. And what happened at the moment, at the moment they're sitting in the house of an art dealer in North Norfolk, and they're going to be exhibited at the Holt Festival at the end of July. and then they're going to be sold. And apparently what happened was that they just sat there in the office at Bonhams for 9 years while the family and Bonhams argued about what would happen to them. Bonhams having finally the family having finally got fed up, they turned to the employee of the auction house who had actually worked with them on discovering them, and he's the chap who's going to sell them for them. And I have seen, it is extraordinarily poignant because there is a brown paper envelope with a tiny penciled rubric on the front just saying, "Burn after death, EC." And EC died in 1962. Nobody did burn them. And there are fascinating questions about this. Did Susanna, her daughter, know they were there? Did she know that they exist? They were in the wood chip. They were literally found under a lot of sawdust as people cleared out the house. Now, I wonder whether she did. I think they might just have been left there, in the presumption that they would be discovered and that they weren't. I've only had the briefest skim through them, but I can tell you that they are unutterably fascinating. There are some very early ones, handwritten ones from 1931, when the relationship was just beginning, and they say things like, I'd better not call at your house. We don't want there to be a scandal. This sort of this, and then it goes on, and you can see that the relationship is becoming more problematic. And there are notes of sort of, "Where were you? I waited for 20 minutes. Why didn't you turn up? Can you try and come tomorrow?" This sort of thing. The Collinses got married in 1934, and almost immediately went off to the Far East. But there are several quite long, 4 or 5 page typewritten ones where Orwell, rather than lamenting his lost love by this point, is writing about books that he's been reading and his thoughts on the world situation, and filling in all kinds of fascinating gaps that biographers such as myself have been puzzling over for years as to where he actually was at a certain point in the 1930s. There are whole stretches of Orwell's life, whole weeks and months and fortnights sometimes, where you don't know where he is, or there are letters to his agent saying, "I'm going on holiday soon," and you think, "Well, where? Did you go? Did you come back? What was all that about?" I've only spent half an hour just literally leafing through them on my knee. I'm hoping to get a set of photocopies in the next few months because fortunately the dealer is very sensible of his responsibilities, and the idea is that, they will get sold. I imagine they will probably get sold to another dealer. They'll probably get sold to someone like Richard Koski. They're probably worth £150,000, I would have thought, of today's values, those 19, this little folder full of stuff. But the hope is, the presumption is, I think it's accurate to say, is that before they are, or as they are sold, copies of those letters will be deposited in the Orwell archive, University College London, so that Richard, obviously who actually owns the copyright of them, whose father's letters they are, can have a look at them, and then Orwell scholars will be able to have a look at them, and then it is to be hoped in the fullness of time they will come out into the public domain. But I would say, just having, as I say, this is just based on half an hour's skimming through them, I would say that in terms of the quality and the quantity of the material, this is the most important Orwell find for about 30, if not 40 years, I would have said. There is some amazing stuff in there. This is the record of a relationship that we didn't really know a great deal about, in a place, Orwell's relationship to which we also don't know a very great deal about, but we can see it going forward. It didn't just stop in 1933, it continued for several years, so we can see Orwell keeping his friendships up. And to me, I just sort of sat there and exclaimed and thought to myself, years on the trail of this. And slightly embarrassing, I think, in terms of my non-relationship with Susanna Collins' descendants, because I've written several cross articles in newspapers saying, why can't we see these things? What are these people doing? Where have those letters gone? But anyway, persistence better. There they are. So the whole thing, I believe, is going to be made public in the next couple of days when the programme for the whole festival is announced. Anybody who wants to go along to Hull at the end of July, I think they're simply going to be sort of displayed on boards. They're literally going to be sort of put up in frames. Obviously, nobody with a smartphone will be allowed in the room. CCTV cameras will be on, have all angles covered. But they will be available for the public to go and inspect them. And I hope that certainly by the autumn they will be available for scholars, biographers, members of the public with access to the Orwell archive. I hope to go and have a look at them. So that is the twist in the tale. Eleanor, Dennis and Eric, over 80 years ago now, but the evidence is all there, and it's going to, I hope, add a completely new dimension to Orwell studies in the 1930s. Thank you.